So I haven't been too interested in watching many new shows lately, as a majority of shows just aren't enticing enough to hold my attention each week. So I usually end up watching just the first couple episodes of random shows and then quickly losing any motivation to continue watching until months later. But there's been one show specifically that has somewhat reignited my love for anime and manga again. Osama Ranking, or Ranking of Kings, is a fantasy story about a young prince and his journey from a seemingly weak and gullible deaf child to an extremely strong and respected prince who most people adore. There's probably going to be some spoilers, but I'm going to avoid as many as I can, so here's your warning. The story begins by following around the main character, Prince Boji, while he wanders around the kingdom as a deaf child who is unable to properly communicate with a vast majority of the people, which seems like some pretty awful parenting, especially coming from a royal family where I assume there will be at least some people who don't like him and want to cause harm to him. Which is kind of funny because the next character we meet, Kage, a surviving member of the notorious cursed assassin clan called the Shadow Clan, ends up crossing paths with Boji and basically robs him at sword point, knife point, sword point, I guess. But then Boji realizes very quickly that Kage can actually understand him, and therefore he sees Kage as a potential friend rather than somebody who is literally robbing him. Boji ends up coming back to Kage regularly to give him more and more things, and just to hang out and pretend he has a friend, I guess. Kage ends up growing more and more curious about Boji and eventually follows him home one day, only to immediately see the actual world that Boji is living in. While walking down the street, Boji is constantly laughed at and made fun of. Kids approach him and can't understand him and mock him for it. As he approaches the castle, the guards look down on him. His own stepmother berates him and treats him like an idiot. Boji is essentially alone completely. He ends up going back to his room fighting back tears, and when he's finally alone, he's still smiling through all the pain. And it immediately shifts the character, who starts off as being a bit of a dumb, silly character that doesn't really understand the world due to his flaws, into someone who's trying his absolute hardest to hold himself together while the world around him hates him. He's living in a world where he's just an outcast, a kingdom that makes fun of him and treats him like he's worthless as a person, and nobody even tries to understand him. In the second half of the first episode, Boji ends up dueling his younger half-brother Daida, where the entire group of people watching are just expecting him to lose. Nobody thinks Boji is competent enough to even do anything to the superior Daida. But that doesn't stop Boji from proving everybody wrong. He dodges everything Daida throws at him, but he's just too weak to win. But from this match, the tides start to shift and the real story begins, with Boji and Kage becoming one of my favorite duos in anime history as they progress towards the ultimate goal of making Boji into a great king. When it comes to stories in general, I find it's very difficult for me to actually believe that the world and its people are real. It seems like most of the stories I read or shows I watch take a partially developed world and try and convince you that everything in it is somehow how it should be. But that's rarely the case. Characters usually feel like they're made specifically for a role in a story, and not the story is built around a thriving world full of real people, which builds up a slight disconnect for me personally. I still really enjoy stories like that, but I think we've gotten to a point where we've become too conditioned on how stories generally are told, where we see the entirety of a few conflicts and then it's just over. The entire story is contained in a small bubble where things don't really need to continue past the happy ending. A lot of stories, at least to me, feel like the world starts and ends specifically for the moment we see, which always leaves me with a feeling of emptiness because I'm always viewing more or less a hollow world, where things don't hold any weight and everything exists for the sake of the story alone, rather than just being a small snippet of a beautiful world, which isn't necessarily bad, and I do really enjoy those stories for the most part, but most worlds just feel empty and dead whenever I look at them. They don't feel real, and that's probably the biggest part of why I immediately fell in love with Ousama Ranking. It does an incredible job at world building and making everything feel like it's an actual, real, and thriving world full of infinite stories. There didn't seem to be any characters written specifically for this moment in the world. They all felt like they had their own stories going on, and any of them could have taken the role of protagonist and led us on a completely different direction throughout the entirety of the story. I thought that the ending of the show left a lot of open points, and it didn't really wrap up a whole lot, which initially just felt completely wrong. It didn't even feel like an ending because there's just so much stuff left mid-story. But looking back on it, that might be the perfect way to end a story like this for now. The world continues existing despite the story ending. There's still conflicts going on, things that need to be done, and sure, we might not have gotten to see everything reach the happy ending, but we were never meant to see any of it. We only existed in a brief window to look in and see an actual living world, and that's how it felt to me, and it was perfect. With all of the characters feeling like real people with their own lives, it made each character really interesting, and throughout the show, I was finding myself wanting to learn more about each one introduced. There are so many interesting characters that you never actually get to know, like Bebin the snake dude, Oaken the cursed immortal dude, there's this demon guy, Miranjo, Appease, all these guys, and these guys. There are so many great characters with such little actual information, but it's also enough information for their purpose, which leaves you wanting a bit more from them. Like, there's a character in episode 4 called the Mad King. He is a complete mystery, and honestly, he's one of my favorite characters, despite knowing essentially nothing about him. Boji meets him in a forest after getting separated from his group and falling into a pitfall trap. The Mad King essentially just hangs out with Boji for the day, and you get to see a small glimpse of what his life is like. But other than that, he's just non-existent throughout the series. There are so many possibilities for the character, and there's even a different character with a backstory that could tie in and potentially be the origin of the Mad King. But it's an unconfirmed tie-in, so the possibilities for him are just endless for now. I can understand a lot of people not liking this way of character writing, but for me personally, it ironically adds a lot to each character and allows for more mysteries that gives the viewers more chances to theorize or even create their own headcanons for, which I'm all for. And even with the characters that have a decent amount of background information, they're all written extremely well and are very easy to care about. You end up wanting to see more of them and genuinely wish the best for every single character, hoping that they all reach their goals and overcome everything in their path, which brings out some pretty good character development. Boji initially comes off as a stupid, weak character who is far too trusting in everyone he runs into, but I think that's one of the things that makes him so lovable. Boji's entire character starts off with a pure innocence that just doesn't exist in most stories, but he also has a lot of self-doubt and confidence issues coming from years of being treated poorly and looked down upon. It takes Kage's unrelenting belief in Boji's abilities to finally help him start to overcome these problems, bringing out the absolute best in him. And Boji brings out the best in Kage too. Kage grew up being completely hated and used by pretty much everyone, making him extremely untrusting. Both characters lived in a world of isolation and loneliness, and could never leave it on their own, and needed each other to break out of it. Usually I hate the stereotypical power of friendship stuff, but in this case I don't really mind it. A lot of characters and stories have flaws that they need to overcome, but with Boji, it's almost like he refuses to let his problems weigh him down, as much as other characters would. He was just born a bit different and tried his absolute best to keep up with everyone else, and eventually surpass them all. If Boji can go out and achieve greatness, then why can't we? He has some tangible character flaws that can easily be related to, and he's always working towards his goals, constantly smiling with that weird little V-mouth thing. I think Boji is one of the best examples of overcoming weakness and not letting anything prevent you from achieving what you want. Starting off as two relatively weak and flawed characters, Kage and Boji both end up as completely new people with entirely new outlooks on the world, and it's great. But my favorite character shift in the show has to be Daida's entire personality change. He starts off as just an awful person, the pretty stereotypical elitist younger brother who makes everything into a competition to show that he is leagues better than Boji in every way possible, even going out of his way to essentially usurp the throne from Boji. He is being manipulated at that time though, so I'm not entirely sure what is his own desire and what isn't, but he constantly acts like a spoiled child who thinks he knows best until the moment he finds himself completely alone. While he's stuck in this situation, he loses his arrogance and begins to progress as a person, slowly learning more and more about what's actually going on and seeing the world for what it really is through someone else's memories and experiences. When he's finally able to return, he's a completely different person who finally realizes that strength just isn't everything, and he actually starts to be a decent person. I don't have a good segue, but I want to talk about the animation. It's pretty stylized and could be a little off-putting to some, but I think it's really cute and makes it stand out a bit more than most other shows. But looking at the source material, it stays extremely close to how it was actually drawn. It's obviously a lot cleaner looking, but it keeps up the seemingly low effort style. When I first saw the manga panels, I was instantly reminded of how One Punch Man's webcomic version is. And I really like when manga and comics are like that, where it's a lot more emphasized in the writing and character development rather than just focusing too much on the art and how it looks and ending up with a boring and sloppily written story. I would much rather have a fantastic story with stick figures than a boring story with insane art. I've been kind of putting off making this video for a while because I can't really express how good I think this show is. It literally has everything I want in a story. It has monsters, knights, assassins, betrayal and forgiveness. It feels real to me. There's a giant three-headed snake. There's a good-looking stepmom who I've somehow entirely failed to mention until now. Queen Healing is such a great character. Just look at her. What's not to love? Literally my waifu of the year. Second to Ronnie, of course. But there are literally so many good things about Ousama ranking. I could actually sit and talk about how much I love this show for hours. And I have to my friends. But I genuinely think that Ousama ranking is a masterpiece. Thanks for watching.